There's a good chance that many of you watching this video might have recently or at one point participated in the gig economy. And the way things are looking, there's a good chance many more of you will in the near future. But let's look back over the history of it, how it has changed and how it could potentially change in the future to better serve people on both sides of these transactions. Joining us now to break it all down is Professor Juliet Schor, the sociologist, professor, and author of the upcoming book, After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked. Professor Schor, welcome to the Damage Report.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very glad to have you on. So you began working on some of this research back when this economy was sort of in its infancy. It certainly wasn't as developed and pervasive as it is now. What made it something that you wanted to really delve into at that point?
I started thinking about this gig economy in 2010. I just published a book called True Wealth. And the premise of that book was the idea that people could de-link from corporate jobs, have more freedom in their lives, work for themselves more, live maybe more simply, do a little bit more self-provisioning. And so I got interested in the gig economy as one component of this, what I call plenitude lifestyle.
And so, like as I alluded to in the intro, it has changed. Like there were some early efforts and things like that, possibly stretching back even further. But now, pretty much anything you can conceive of a person doing for you as a service probably has an app dedicated specifically to that. I'm wondering if at the point when you began your research, is this how you saw it developing? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, sort of has it lived up to the promise of the initial days?
Well, the simple answer to your question is no, it hasn't. I certainly wasn't thinking about the spread of gig work to doctors and lawyers and people like myself, professors, which we have seen. I was thinking more about the parts of the gig economy that are perhaps better known to people, things like what we might call consumer or personal services, people sharing homes, if they were driving somewhere, letting somebody else take a seat in the car. Those are the kinds of things that were being promised in the early days of the gig economy. And things have gone very differently since then on a number of the most important platforms. Of course, the ride hailing and lodging platforms are the biggest platforms in this part of the gig economy. And they're also platforms where we've seen tremendous change from the early promise to the way they're operating today.
Yeah, and as you point out, there have been things like Couchsurfer for a long time, and I don't know if there was an equivalent in terms of ride sharing, but I can certainly conceive of it that it's not monetized in the way that things like Uber and Lyft and things like that are. So you said that it hasn't really lived up to its promise. I don't know how exactly this would be quantified, but perhaps you could just give your impression. As more and more of these services have been made available, and in some cases have pushed out traditional alternatives like Uber, replacing for a lot of people taxi services and things like that. Being able to rent someone's apartment is very different than just staying in a hotel or a motel. Do we have an idea of whether this is actually benefiting consumers, if their satisfaction or the money that they're spending is actually being benefited from the proliferation of these sorts of services?
I think for the consumers, the story is a lot more positive than for the earners. So what consumers have gotten is much lower priced alternatives. The ride hail being a great example, much cheaper than taxis. Why? Well, a lot of reasons, basically exploiting the drivers, not paying their fair share in terms of benefits and so forth is one reason. Airbnb, much cheaper than hotels in lots of places. So the consumers are the ones who benefited the most. And I think that's part of why these platforms have grown as rapidly as they have. But where you see a lot more problems is either in the ride hail or food delivery and some of the other big gig labor platforms, the deterioration of conditions for workers, and there's a lot more to say about that. And in the lodging platforms, the people who operate them and the consumers are mostly happy. It's the people who live in the neighborhoods or the cities where a lot of rental properties have been taken off the market or whose neighborhoods have been flooded with tourists. So I like to think of those as sort of the users of the platform for Airbnb are a lot happier than the people who are being the non-users who are being affected by that activity.
And in terms of, continue.
You got a little bit of that in ride hail too, because ride hail has increased congestion. It has increased traffic fatalities after a long period of declining fatalities. It has increased carbon emissions quite a bit across the country. So these platforms have a lot of what economists call externalities, which is impacts on people who are not, they're not participating, but yet they're bearing those costs.
And in terms of potentially moving this back in a more positive direction where everyone benefits, maybe not equally, but that they all benefit, are we looking at the possible resumption of some of these forms of the sharing economy, perhaps providing alternatives to some of the monetized versions? Or is it a case where government needs to get involved and regulate in terms of labor rights and things like that?
I actually think there are a number of things we can do. Definitely government needs to be involved, and we're starting to see that there's a minimum wage that ride hail platforms have to pay in New York. Seattle is also considering that. A number of cities beginning in 2008 started regulating Airbnb much more seriously. So there's regulation. Workers in ride hail are also fighting for employee status and to unionize. So those are the sort of conventional ways to go. And then you raise the prospect of a sort of less commercial sharing economy, more like what that early vision was. I think that's absolutely should be part of the equation. And I'll throw in one more idea, something that I've studied and a lot of people are excited about, and that's what we call the platform cooperative, where the workers themselves own the platform. And we're seeing small movements in this direction. There is a ride hail platform in Denver called Green Taxi. There's a house cleaning co-op in New York. There's a nurses co-op in California. And I studied one of the first big platform co-ops, which was a stock photographers platform owned by the photographers. And those work really well for the workers.
So Professor, you mentioned some of these sort of cooperative alternatives in some areas. And it seems like one of the advantages that the big services, Airbnb and Uber and Lyft will have is that they have the platform. They have the app, which is battle tested and it's fairly universal. I've used it in other countries even. Are these cooperatives, I'm trying to figure out how that could potentially spread beyond just one community, perhaps. Is it possible to have a community of communities on something like this if they had the tech app infrastructure provided in some way?
Absolutely. So we just call that interoperability across these apps. So you'd have a local taxi app, say a ride hail app, and you use that app when you go to another city. It's like those, we call them easy passes here in Massachusetts, but the transponders that you use to go through toll areas on the highways, they work across all the states, even though yours is based in Massachusetts. It's got interoperability with New York. And I think that's a really important feature, but one that's very feasible. It just means that these local entities need to be part of a network. And that's the world today is networks. So yes, that part I think is one of the easier dimensions of this.
So I want to ask you one more question though. Looking forward, we talked about what you perhaps imagined about where this would all go back when you were in the beginning stages of your research. We're now like a decade into that. Looking forward, what do you think? Are there areas where either some version of the more cooperative shared experience or the monetized version will move into that they're not currently in? I know it must be difficult to make those predictions, but I'm just curious based on your research what you imagine happening in the future.
I think we will see expansion of the gig portion in a lot of professional services. So medicine, law, etc. I mean, sort of delinking people from that long-term stable employment. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I just think it is coming, which makes it all the more important that we have I don't even like to call it a safety net. I think that's too negative a terminology, but ideas like a basic income, Medicare for all, that the government provides a certain basic set of rights and incomes to people, so that if we are in these very insecure kinds of work relationships, and that's really key to the gig economy, is that insecurity, it's we're already cushioned, and so the insecurity is not such a problem. Either that, or we've got to go back in the other direction of sort of full-time stable employment. But this halfway point of insecure employment and no proper safety net is a disaster. And I think it's one that people are really beginning to say, wait a second, this isn't working.
Yeah, it's gonna be a hard thing for people to miss when basically everyone knows someone who works with one of these services and is going to hear about their experiences. And we've all been reminded through the course of this year about having things like, for instance, health insurance tied to employment might work in some cases, but when we're in unstable times, especially in terms of public health, that becomes a little bit more dangerous. The book is After the Gig: How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked. It is available for pre-order now and coming out in September. Professor Shore, we appreciate you joining us and breaking all this down for us.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.